Do you believe in near-death experiences? Today, I'm going to tell a real and impressive story of a young woman who went through a devastating accident, had a surprising vision about the future of the planet, and came back transformed. Before we start, comment here from which city you're watching, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this. Let's go. My name is Avery Holbrook. At 32 years old, I live in Flagstaff, Arizona, a city where the starry sky meets the mountains. I have a quiet life, away from the spotlight and sensationalist narratives. I have never written a book, nor stood on a stage to tell what I am going to share here. But sometimes an experience transforms your perspective so much that keeping it to yourself feels selfish. Today, I'm going to tell you about the most decisive moment in my life. An accident, an experience that changed everything I knew about the world and about myself. A second chance I received to make a difference. My mother held my hands while my father put my suitcase in the trunk of the car. I knew they were trying to stay strong, but the sparkle in my mother's eyes gave away the suppressed emotion. Avery, it'll be good for you. Your grandfather is an amazing man, and you'll have a year full of new things to explore, she said, trying to hide her concern. I sighed. You don't have to leave me there. I can stay with Aunt Rachel, I suggested, more out of stubbornness than actually wanting it. Rachel works twice as hard, Avery, my dad interrupted. And it's only for a while. Your grandfather is looking forward to having you around. The idea of moving to Flagstaff seemed suffocating. I was used to living in Denver, surrounded by friends and having access to everything that kept me entertained. Flagstaff, with its promise of fresh air and tranquility, sounded like a sentence of boredom, but I knew this change was inevitable, at least until my parents sorted out their work issues. When we arrived at my grandfather Jack Holbrook's house, I was greeted with a warm smile. He was a man with a serene expression, well-cut white hair, and a posture that was still firm despite his age. "Welcome, baby girl," he said, pulling me into an awkward hug. "I hope you like it here." The house was exactly as I imagined. Dark wood furniture, walls decorated with old paintings, and a smell of strong coffee mixed with something slightly medicinal. The place seemed to scream that I was far away from my world. In the first few days, I tried to adapt. The school was small, and the people seemed friendly but distant. The nights were filled with the sound of the wind rushing through the pine trees and the low sound of the TV in my grandfather's room. He was kind, but also reserved, preferring silence to conversation. "How was school today?" he asked once, while cutting pieces of homemade bread. "Normal," I replied, as I pushed the food around the plate. "Nothing else," he nodded, respecting my space, but I could see the concern in his eyes. It was when I met Lena Whitaker that everything started to change. Lena was an 18-year-old girl with shaggy black hair and a way of walking that seemed to defy the world. We met by chance while I was walking around the city center. "Hey, you're new here, right?" she asked, with a mischievous smile. "I am," I replied, cautiously. "And you are?" "Lena, I can show you the cool places here. Not that there are many," she joked, laughing. I accepted her invitation, and before I knew it, I was being pulled into her world. Lena and her friends were unlike anyone I had ever met. They had old but powerful cars, ears always attentive to music that seemed to scream rebellion, and an apparent freedom that fascinated me. However, I soon began to realize the risks of carrying them. They smoked, drank, and had the dangerous ability to turn any rule into a suggestion. Still, something in me couldn't shake it. "Come on, Avery. It's just a silly dare. No one will notice," Lena would say, encouraging me to participate in a convenience store robbery. I hesitated, but the desire to be accepted was too strong. The following months brought me increasing guilt and regret, but I still didn't know how to get out of that circle. I woke up to the annoying sound of the alarm on my cell phone. The night before was another one of those where I stayed up late talking to Lena. Nothing important, just jokes and stupid plans for the next time we would go out. However, the weight in my eyes was unbearable, and looking at the clock, I realized that I was late for school. "Shit," I muttered, throwing the blanket aside and rushing to get dressed. I chose the first sweatshirt I saw, a faded gray one, and put on sneakers without even bothering with socks. Deep down, I knew I had already missed the bus, but the idea of facing my grandfather's scolding was even worse. I ran downstairs and grabbed an apple from the kitchen. My grandfather was sitting at the table, reading the newspaper as he always did. He looked over his glasses and frowned. "Are you going to walk today?" he asked, noticing my haste. "Yes, I missed the bus," I replied hastily, biting into the apple as I grabbed my backpack. "It's very foggy out there, Avery. Be careful on the road," he warned, his tone serious. "Okay, Grandpa," I replied, almost walking out the door before he could say anything else. The fog was thick, a white layer that enveloped everything around, making it difficult to see more than a few meters ahead. The road leading to the school was a rural road with no sidewalks, surrounded by trees that looked even more ominous under the veil of fog. I clutched my backpack against my back and walked quickly, trying to ignore the growing discomfort in my chest. As I walked, my thoughts turned to my recent life. What was I doing? Why did I keep following Lena and her friends? The laughter and moments of adrenaline could no longer mask the guilt I felt. I knew I was moving away from the person I wanted to be, but I didn't know how to get back. My reverie was interrupted by the sound of an engine in the distance. I turned to look, but the fog was too thick to see anything. I continued walking, assuming the vehicle would pass me without any problems. It was a mistake. Suddenly, everything happened at once. The sound of skidding tires, an instinctive scream of fright, and then the impact. My body was thrown into the air like a doll, and pain washed over me. It was a deep pain, which seemed to rip the air from my lungs and erase any coherent thought. I fell to the ground, unable to move. Everything around me was a blur. The sound of rushing footsteps, a male voice shouting something I couldn't understand, and the insistent ringing in my ears. My vision blurred, and darkness began to envelop me. It was then that I felt something strange. The pain began to disappear, as if being anesthetized. My body felt light, almost floating, and a strange peace began to envelop me. It wasn't the kind of peace you feel after a tiring day. It was something bigger, deeper. The last thing I heard was a voice in the distance. "Please stay with me. Stay with me." Then everything was silent. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the ordinary kind, full of small sounds in the background, but an absolute silence that seemed to envelop everything around me. It was strange. The pain that had consumed my body minutes before was simply gone. I felt weightless, like I was floating, but there was no sensation of ground beneath my feet. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer on the road. The place where I was impossible to describe precisely, but I will try. It was like being in an infinite space filled with soft, golden light, but it wasn't a light that hurt the eyes. It was warm, welcoming, and seemed to carry with it an energy of peace and love that enveloped me completely. I didn't know how much time had passed or where exactly I was. The concept of time seemed irrelevant there. As I looked around, a feeling of familiarity hit me. It was as if I had been there before, although my mind couldn't understand how or why. "You've come this far, Avery," a soft voice echoed. It didn't come from anywhere in particular, but it seemed to be everywhere. It was deep, comforting, and at the same time, it had a strength that made me pay attention. Before I could respond or even formulate a thought, I began to relive moments from my life. It was like watching a movie, but with an emotional intensity I had never experienced before. I saw scenes from my childhood, my first day of school, my mother's warm hugs, the pride on my father's face when I managed to ride my bike without help. Then came moments that I would rather forget. I saw the times I made fun of other kids at school, believing it made me stronger. I relived the petty thefts I committed with Lena and the group, the lies I told my grandfather, and the void those actions left in me. Each scene was accompanied by a strange feeling. Not only did I relive my actions, but I felt the emotions of the people on the other side. The embarrassment of a classmate I had ridiculed, the disappointment of the store owner who realized something was missing, the silent grief of my grandfather when he noticed my distance. It was painful, but also transformative. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked finally, my voice fragile and hesitant. It was then that the figure appeared. He was not like the images I had seen in religious pictures or books. He was simple, modestly dressed, but he exuded a light and presence that brought me to my knees. I didn't need to ask who it was. You knew in some deep, intuitive way. "Avery," he said, with a voice that seemed to carry the weight of the universe and, at the same time, the lightness of forgiveness. "You are loved. You always have been. But it's time for you to understand the impact of your choices and the purpose for which you were created. He showed me the future, a world about to face climate challenges and profound transformations, but also a promise of renewal and peace. It was not a prophecy to scare me, but to encourage me. There is hope, he said, but you need to do your part. The choice will always be yours. It was at that moment that I understood that I was facing a decision. I could stay there, in that state of peace and comfort, or return to the world I had left behind, with all its imperfections and difficulties. My first reaction was to want to stay. There was no pain, there was no fear. But then I thought about my grandfather, my parents, and all the things I could still do. I want to go back, I declared, my voice gaining strength. And I want to do better. The figure smiled, and I felt a surge of love so powerful that my tears began to fall. Then come back, he said, and take this with you. When he said, then come back, I felt like something was pulling me back into my body. But the process was more emotional than physical. Before I could fully return, he approached, his eyes shining with an indescribable light. Avery, before you go, know that your life will not be easy. There will be challenges and times when you doubt yourself, but remember, you are not alone. Love is the answer, always. You have a chance to change, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. I wanted to ask so many things. Why me? What exactly should I do? But the words didn't come. It seemed like he already knew what I needed to understand, even if I hadn't asked the questions. With one last look of love and acceptance, he touched my forehead lightly, and it was as if a ray of warmth penetrated my soul. Suddenly, the light around me began to fade, and the feeling of peace was replaced by something heavier, more real. Absolute silence gave way to the sound of hurried voices and the noise of machines. I felt the weight of my body again, the sharp pain in my arms and legs, and a constant ringing in my ears. My mind began to clear. When I opened my eyes, the sterile white ceiling of the hospital was the first thing I saw. Everything seemed more vivid, more intense. The fluorescent lights, the smell of disinfectant, the sound of beeping monitors. It was a stark contrast to where I had been moments before. Avery, can you hear me? My grandfather's voice was weak but full of emotion. I looked to the side and saw him sitting in a chair next to the bed. He held my hand tightly, as if he was afraid of losing me again. Grandpa! My voice was hoarse, almost inaudible. Thank God! He exclaimed, his eyes filling with tears. You're here! I thought... He couldn't finish the sentence, and instead, he squeezed my hand even tighter. That's when I started to notice the details. My arm was in a cast, there were scratches across my face, and a persistent pain on the right side of my body. I was alive, but barely. And yet, through it all, I felt a rush of gratitude. It was as if every breath was a gift, every beat of my heart proof that I had been blessed with a second chance. Later, the doctor entered the room. He was a tall, soft-spoken man. Avery, you were in a serious accident. You were hit by a car while walking. The driver called emergency services immediately, and you were brought here. Frankly, it's a miracle you're alive. Your injuries could have been much worse. I remember some things, I muttered. The light, the peace, it was so real. The doctor smiled understandingly, but in disbelief. These experiences can be caused by trauma, lack of oxygen to the brain. It wasn't just that, I interrupted, my voice firm despite the weakness. It was more than that. He nodded, but didn't respond. It was clear he didn't want to discuss it, but I knew what I had experienced. No one could convince me otherwise. That night, as my grandfather dozed in the chair next to his bed, I looked up at the ceiling of the hospital room and made a silent promise. I didn't know exactly how or where to start, but I knew my life had changed. I could no longer go back to the same mistakes, the same choices that brought me to that moment. I had a new chance, and I would make it worth it. The days following the accident were a blur of tests, medications, and visits. The hospital seemed sterile, but the constant movement of nurses and doctors kept it alive. Every time a new person entered my room, I felt overwhelmed with a mixture of tiredness and gratitude. I was alive. This was the truth that constantly echoed in my mind. My grandfather was with me all the time. He seemed determined not to leave my side, even when the nurses insisted he rest. So I'm not going anywhere, he said firmly, his voice filled with a fatherly concern I hadn't noticed before. In one of these moments, as he adjusted the blanket over me, I risked asking, "Grandpa, do you believe in miracles?" He stopped, looking at me with his deep blue eyes, now lined with lines of worry and relief. "I think I do. Yes," he replied calmly. "And you're proof of that, Avery." I wanted to tell him everything I had experienced, the light, the peace, the divine figure who gave me a second chance. But something held me back. I didn't know if he would understand or if he would think I was delusional. "It's strange to think about how everything can change so quickly," I muttered, looking away. "Sometimes almost losing something is what makes you truly appreciate it," he said, with the wisdom typical of someone who has lived a long time. Those words stuck with me, resonating in my mind like a constant reminder. When I was finally discharged, returning to my grandfather's house was a different experience. The place looked the same, the dark wood furniture, the smell of strong coffee in the morning. But something inside me had changed. Every corner of that house seemed filled with a meaning that I couldn't explain. One afternoon, as I was recovering on the couch, Lena appeared. She didn't seem like the same confident, fearless Lena I knew. There was something in his eyes, a mixture of guilt and relief. "Hey," she began, a little hesitantly. "I just wanted to check on you." "I'm fine. All things considered," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. She sat in the opposite armchair, fiddling with the bracelets she wore on her wrist. "Avery, I feel bad. I know I pulled you into a lot of bullshit. I didn't want you to end up hurt." There was a heavy silence between us before I finally responded. "Lena, it wasn't just you. I made choices. I chose to follow you and the others. But that has to change. I can't keep living like this." She looked at me with surprise, as if she hadn't expected that answer. "Change? What do you mean?" "I don't know exactly," I admitted, looking out the window at the pine trees that swayed gently in the wind. "But I know I don't want this life anymore. I need something more, something that makes sense." She sighed and nodded, but didn't respond. The expression on her face showed that perhaps she wasn't ready to follow the same path. Over the next few days, I started making small decisions that marked the beginning of my change. I deleted some people's phone numbers. I stopped responding to group posts that led me down bad paths. It wasn't easy. There was a part of me that feared isolation, but the other part knew it was necessary. Life with my grandfather became a source of comfort. He patiently helped me with everything, from simple tasks to the moments when I needed to vent. He never pushed, just listened. "You don't need all the answers right now," he said one night as he made us both tea. "Just take it one step at a time." One day, as I was walking on my front porch, the sound of tires on gravel caught my attention. It was a car I didn't recognize. When the door opened, a man came out. He looked tense, his hands stuffed in his coat pockets. It was Michael Crow, the driver who had hit me. "Hi," he began, his voice hesitant. "No, I'm probably the last person you want to see, but I needed to come here." I was surprised, but I motioned for him to continue. "Okay, what do you mean?" He took a deep breath. "I'm so sorry. I know it doesn't change what happened, but I can't get it out of my head. I've been thinking about how I could have done something different, how I could have prevented you." There was a pause as I processed his words. I felt no anger, no pain, just something new. "Michael," I began, my voice low but firm, "you don't have to carry this weight alone. It was an accident, and somehow it brought me to where I am now. Maybe we both have something to learn from this." His eyes filled with tears as he nodded. It was there that I realized that forgiveness was not just a gift for those who received it, but also for those who offered it. The days after my encounter with Michael marked the beginning of a journey I barely knew was beginning. It wasn't just about forgiving him, but also about learning to forgive myself. The accident didn't just take me off the path I was on. It opened doors that I didn't even know existed before. My first concrete decision was to look for a support group. I knew I needed a space to share what I was feeling, but most importantly, to listen. I found a youth group in the city, organized by a social worker called Helen Carter, who had also overcome her own story of bad choices and redemption. When I first walked into the small community room, I felt a knot in my stomach. The chairs were arranged in a circle, and the people already there looked so different from me. Some were young people facing family problems, others were struggling with addictions, and some just seemed lost, like me. Helen greeted me with a warm smile. "You must be Avery. Welcome. This is a room to listen and be heard. There is no judgment here." I nodded, not knowing if I would be able to speak. When it was my turn, I took a deep breath. "My name is Avery, and, well, I had an accident that changed my life. Before that, I was making bad choices. I knew I was making mistakes, but I didn't seem to have the strength to get out of it. The accident forced me to stop and think about who I want to be." People listened silently, some nodding as if they understood exactly what I was saying. When I finished, a girl named Emily, who looked about my age, said, "Thanks for sharing, Avery. It's hard to admit our mistakes, but I think it's a big step." I started attending meetings regularly, and each week I felt a part of me grow stronger. It was as if, by sharing my experiences and listening to others, I was rebuilding my identity piece by piece. More than that, I began to realize that my choices had an impact not only on me, but on everyone around me. Michael also appeared in the group. I don't know exactly what took him there, but he was different, lighter, perhaps. At one of the meetings, he spoke about the accident for the first time. I never imagined that a moment of distraction could change so much. Avery has forgiven me, but I'm still learning to forgive myself. I'm here because I want to be a better person, for myself and for others. After the meeting, we talked as we walked to our cars. "You know," I began, "I always thought I was weak, that I couldn't change, but I think we're here to prove that we can." He smiled, a sincere smile. "You're a lot stronger than you think, Avery, and maybe that strength is something we can help find in each other." Inspired by the stories I heard in the group and my own journey, I decided to start volunteering at a youth center. There, I met young people who faced challenges similar to mine: peer pressure, poor choices, and the feeling of being trapped in an endless cycle. It wasn't easy, but every conversation, every little progress showed me that I was on the right path. One afternoon, as I was helping a boy named Liam solve a math problem, he looked at me and asked, "Do you ever feel like you messed up and couldn't fix it?" I hesitated for a moment, but then I smiled. "Already, many times. But do you know what I learned? We can always start again. It doesn't matter how many times we fall. What matters is what we do next." He seemed to consider my words, and in that moment, I saw something in his eyes, a small spark of hope. And I realized that maybe this was what I was destined to do: light these sparks in people who needed them. My relationship with Lena also changed. She was still stuck in the lifestyle I had left behind, but we began to naturally drift away. There was no hurt, just different paths. I knew I couldn't save her, but I also knew that my transformation could somehow inspire her to make her own changes. The weeks turned into months, and little by little, my life began to take a different shape. It wasn't perfect, and there were still difficult days, but now there was purpose. I was building something, not just for myself, but for others. As much as I felt like my life was changing, not everyone around me shared the same vision. It was as if a shadow hung over every attempt to share my experience. In the support group, I could be open, talk about what I experienced and the divine figure who transformed my perspective. But beyond that, it was a completely different story. My first attempt to share my experience with an outsider came in a casual conversation with a classmate, Emily, not the same one from the group, but a girl I had known since arriving in Flagstaff. We were sitting in the cafeteria, eating lunch, when she commented, "I heard you almost died. That must have been scary." "It was more than scary," I replied, hesitantly. "I saw things, felt things I can't explain. It was like I was somewhere else, surrounded by light, peace, and someone was there with me." He gave me a second chance. She raised her eyebrows, dropping the sandwich on the tray. "Like, did you see God or something?" "Yes," I admitted, feeling heat rise to my face. "I think it was him, or maybe Jesus. I'm not sure how to explain it, but it was real as we are here now." Emily was silent for a moment, but then let out a short, uncomfortable laugh. "Wow, that's deep. But, like, you think it wasn't all in your head? I mean, you were hurt and probably drugged up." Her words hit me like a bucket of cold water. "It wasn't that," I replied, my voice a little firmer. "I know what I experienced. It was more than physical. It was something bigger. "Okay, if you say so," she replied, clearly skeptical, before changing the subject. This conversation was one of the first signs that not everyone was ready or willing to hear what I had to say. Over time, I realized that trying to explain my experience to people often resulted in suspicious looks or quick changes of subject. Some old friends even started to distance themselves, as if my new perspective made them uncomfortable. This led to a period of isolation. There were days when I wondered if I should just keep everything to myself, pretend nothing had happened. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the answer. My experience had changed everything. To ignore it would be dishonest to myself. It was in this moment of doubt that I found comfort in a community I never imagined existed. One night, while surfing the internet looking for answers, I came across a forum of people who reported near-death experiences. They shared stories that sounded so familiar: lights, divine figures, feelings of peace, and the choice between staying or going back. I decided to join the online group, working up the courage to share my story in a post. To my surprise, I received responses from people who not only believed me, but had also gone through similar experiences. "You're not alone," a woman named Laura responded. "We all carry these memories as a gift, but also as a burden. It's not easy, but it's important." This community gave me strength to continue. They taught me that it was not necessary to convince everyone about what I experienced. The most important thing was how it had transformed me and how I would use that transformation to do good. Meanwhile, my relationship with Michael continued to grow. He also faced skepticism, both from coworkers and his own family, who thought he was overreacting in his quest for redemption. "It seems like people are afraid of anything that defies logic," he said during one of our walks. "But what I experienced with you, Avery, has nothing to do with logic. It's something bigger." His words resonated deeply with me. Maybe we didn't need validation from everyone. Maybe the simple fact that we had changed was proof enough. This period of skepticism taught me an important lesson. Some things don't need to be explained, just experienced. The most important thing was to stay true to what I learned and let my actions speak for me. My journey began to take shape when I accepted that I didn't need to convince anyone about my experience. What mattered was what I did with the second chance I was given. With this understanding, I began looking for ways to transform the pain and lessons of my past into something meaningful. It all started at the Flagstaff Youth Center, a small but welcoming space that offered support to young people in at-risk situations. I discovered the place in a casual conversation with Helen, the social worker who led the support group I attended. "Avery, I think you could really help here," she said one day as we set up chairs after a meeting. "You have a story that can reach these young people. They need someone who understands the challenges they face." The idea scared me at first. Someone who made so many bad choices, now helping others avoid the same path? But there was something about that suggestion that lit a fire in me. Maybe, just maybe, I could make a difference. My first day as a volunteer was full of nervousness. I was greeted by Liam, a 14-year-old boy who looked like he had already faced a lot more than someone his age should have. He was sitting in a corner, arms crossed, clearly suspicious. As I approached, he gave me a look that said, "Don't try to save me." "Hey," I started, trying to sound casual. "I'm Avery. It's my first day here. It looks like you already know the place." He looked at me for a moment, considering whether it was worth answering. "Liam," he finally said, without much enthusiasm. "It's no big deal." "Yeah, I guess you're right," I replied with a smile, sitting in the chair next to him. "But sometimes small places can make a big difference." He didn't respond, but he didn't get up to leave either. That was enough for me. As the weeks went by, I began to meet more young people like Liam, each with their own story of struggle, loss, and, in some cases, regret. It wasn't easy. Many of them resisted any attempt at connection, but I persisted. I remembered how I felt before the accident, lost and directionless, and I used that to find empathy. One afternoon, while helping a group with an art activity, a girl named Tessa approached me. She was 16 years old, with dyed blue hair, and a tired expression that seemed to belong to someone much older. "Do you really think people can change?" he asked abruptly. I was taken by surprise by the question, but I answered honestly, "I think so. But not because someone says you should change. It has to come from within, you know? You have to want it for yourself. She seemed to consider my words before muttering, maybe. My work at the youth center not only helped others, but also continued to change me. It was as if every conversation, every little bit of progress, was a reaffirmation of the purpose I felt I had been given. Helping these young people was like reclaiming a part of myself, a part that I didn't know existed before. One day, Helen called me to talk. "Avery, I've seen the impact you have here," she said, smiling warmly. "You have a gift. Have you ever thought about studying something like psychology or social work? I think this suits you." The idea had never crossed my mind, but as she spoke, I felt something awaken inside me. Maybe this was the next step in my journey. Maybe this was the way to expand my purpose and reach even more people. As my work at the youth center progressed, I began to feel a deeper connection to the world around me. It wasn't just about the young people I helped, it was about living with intention. I began to notice the little things, the beauty of the mountains at sunset, the gentle sound of the wind through the pine trees, my grandfather's laugh as we watched a baseball game together. Everything seemed to have more meaning. Every moment was an opportunity to do good, to be grateful, to live fully. I didn't know exactly where my journey would take me, but for the first time, I felt like I was on the right path. As the months turned into years, the sense of purpose in my life only grew. Working at the youth center gave me a deep understanding of how small actions can trigger big changes. But at the same time, a part of me never stopped thinking about the vision I had during my near-death experience, the revelation of the future of the planet. That vision was as clear as any memory I carried. The sky darkened by violent storms, the earth trembling underfoot, and then an indescribable calm, as if the world had been reborn. I knew this wasn't just symbolic. It was a warning, but also a promise of hope. On a cold night in December 2024, as the world prepared for the new year, I found myself sitting on the porch of my grandfather's house, looking up at the starry sky. He was next to me, wrapped in a blanket. "You're thoughtful," he observed, with that calm tone that always made me feel safe. "I am," I admitted, clutching the cup of hot tea between my hands. "There's something I need to share with you, something I saw during the accident." He turned his face to me, attentive. "You can talk, Avery. Nothing you say will scare me." I took a deep breath and began to describe what I had seen, the chaos, the natural disasters, and, finally, the promise of a peaceful future. As he spoke, I watched his face, waiting for any sign of disbelief, but he just listened, his eyes fixed on mine. "Do you think that will happen?" he asked, after a long silence. I don't know," I answered honestly, "but I think it's a warning, not to scare us, but to prepare us, to remind us that we still have a choice." He nodded slowly, looking up at the sky. "You know, Avery, the world has been through a lot of difficult times. Maybe what you've seen is the next big challenge, but from what you've told me, it seems like there's hope, too." His words brought an unexpected calm. As simple as they were, they captured what I had been trying to understand since the accident. The future was not a sentence, but an opportunity. In the following days, the feeling of urgency intensified. I knew I couldn't ignore this vision. I decided to share what I had seen with the people who trusted me most, Helen and Michael. We organized a small meeting at the youth center just to discuss how we could help our community prepare emotionally and spiritually for uncertain times. "We don't need to preach the end of the world," I said, as we sat around a table. "But we can help people connect with each other, find strength and purpose, no matter what." Michael, who had become my greatest ally, added, "If there's one thing we can do, it's remind people that even in the midst of chaos, they are not alone." Over time, I built a life that, although simple, was full of meaning. I married Michael in a small ceremony, surrounded by friends, young people from the center, and, of course, my grandfather, who insisted on dancing the night away. We form a family and teach our children the importance of empathy, resilience, and love. But most of all, I continued to live with a commitment to honor the second chance I was given. I didn't become famous, nor did I write books or give great talks. I just went on with my life, helping whoever crossed my path, knowing that each act of kindness contributed to something greater. Today, when I look back, I see that the experience that almost took my life also gave me one. It wasn't just an accident or a vision. It was a call to live with purpose. And despite the challenges the world continues to face, I remain hopeful that the promised new era is upon us, guided by the love, compassion, and strength of us all.